So yeah, the lineage prayer will do in Tibetan, and you can read along in English or Chinese and the transliteration as well. Om Doje Changchen Je Lo Na Dang Marpa Mila Joje Gambo Bang Du Song She Sha Kun Kien Ga Mi Bang Jie Ji Zheng Ye Gyu Ba Zhen Na Dvi Ta Sa Sum Pa Den Ju Ba So Za Lan Chak Ya Che La Na Nye Be Nyame Chogon Dabo Kagyu So Wa Debso Kagyu Manam Gyu Pa Zeno Nanda Jingi Lo Zhen Long Gong Gi Kang Pa Sum Ba Zhen Zeno Kun La Cha Je Me Ba Dam Se Di Do Ta Chu Pe Gon Chen La Nye Ku Shen Ba Me Ba Jing Lo Mo Gu Gong Gi Go Wo Sum Ba Jin Me Na Te Go Je Be La La Gyun Du So Wa De Be Gon Chen La Chomi Mogu Kewa Jingi Lo Yang Ming Gongi No Ji Samba Jen Gang Sha To Pe No So Ma De Ma Cho De Ka Jog Be Gon Chen La Ngon cha lo dang ra wa zhen ye lo nan do no wo chu gu san bai zhen chi ya ma ye chi yang cha wa la ma ga ro pa cha we gon je la go de ye me do pa jing ye lo ye wa kun tu yang da la ma dang Rame choki pala lanju jing sada langi yonde nazo ne doje changi go panyo dojo doje changi go panyo dojo 오 상계 조당 속에 조나라 장주바드 단니 갸수지 다게 진속이 배수난기 룰라 벤치 상계 주바쇼 상계 주단 속에 조나람 장주바드 당니 갸수지 다기 진속이 배수난기 룰라 벤치 상계 주바쇼 상계 주당 속에 조나라 장주바드다네 갸수지 나게 진속이 배선한게 룰라 벤지 상계 주바쇼 오 삼진 당지 대화단 대위 기단 덴바주직 dünyada dünya giden ravacı dünya mebe devadan pada min ravacı yerin çadan nidan ravi tanyon cempola nepacı Senjen Tanchi Devada Devi Gyudan Demba Jujik Dünyadan Dünyangi Gyudan Rawa Jujik Dünya Mebe Devadan Adamin Rawa Jujik Yerin Chadan Nidan Rawi Tanyon Jimbola Nepa Jujik Senjen Tanchi Devada Dewe Gyudan Demba Juji Dünyadan Dünyangi Gyudan Rawa Juji Dünya Mebe Devadan Pada Min Rawa Juji Yerin Chagdang Nidan Rawi Tanyon Jembola Nepa Juji and we'll stop here. We won't do the 7 branch. Baden Sawe Lama Rinpoche Dagi Jiwo Pere Denji La Kadrin Jimbo Gongne Jesun De Kuzun Jugi Nondu Sandu Zo Junu Junu Zo Memangi Zonu Malaya Zonu Kegi Jesu Danu Ji Jinu Well, like I said earlier, it's nice to be here. Before we get started, just a reminder: always before teachings, we should give rise to bodhicitta, the wish that all beings may be enlightened, both near and far, as the prayer was saying, but also those who have good relations with us and those who don't have good relations with us, all beings. And we ourselves could become enlightened through the interdependence of hearing the Dharma and practicing the Dharma. And with that intention, we should listen to the teachings. So this is an interesting, the subject of the talk is when to move on in practice. And it's kind of a culminating session at the end of a bunch of classes that have been going on around shamatha and meditation in general through this course. And it's an interesting one. When the courses are set up, they say, hey, these are the courses. Who wants to teach this one? And this is the last one open. And I said, okay. It's a really interesting talk in a sense, because when I normally, kind of expected to share something or teach anything with Dharma, I guess you'd say, I like to go directly from some teaching that I have a connection to, either something that Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche has taught, or something that, I would have received a lung for and things like that. And so then what I would do is share that and only add a few reflections that I have. So it's at best, I'm just helping people understand something that I consider to be flawless. But this is an interesting topic because it doesn't land exactly like that. I'd say it's a little bit more relative, right? So like everybody, when to move on has a lot of factors, and a lot of those factors start to become individual. And so rather than have something that's pre-formatted, I decided to pull from a number of different things and try to curate from a lot of different perspectives and give you something in that regard. So it's a little different for me this time around. So I often like to start I think it's important in any teaching to understand the view of why you're doing what you're doing. Like, what's the purpose of it? What's the intent of it? So, we've been talking about shamatha, but sometimes the further you go into talking about something, you can easily forget why you're doing something, why we're talking about something. So the purpose of shamatha, quite simply, is to tame one's mind. And to put that in context, one of the most famous quotes of the Buddha ever, it's just 4 lines. It says, do no harm, perfectly benefit others, tame your mind. This is what the Buddha taught. So there's it's such a complete statement. It's so rich that there are actually a lot of people have a lot to say about that statement. But the idea, here is to tame our mind. Sometimes there's other teachings to do other things, like to train our mind or to focus on certain, qualities or aspects of mind. But this whole point of shamatha is to tame our mind. And it's interesting because even in that statement, when we sit down to do the shamatha meditation that's been explained previously, when we're doing that, when we're sitting in shamatha meditation, we're not harming anyone. And really, we're not even, we're probably, if we do have some ability to kind of cause ourselves trouble, we're harming ourselves much less just by sitting down, even if we're not having a great meditation session. We're just kind of sitting down, working on ourselves, slowing down, being in the moment, and then perfectly benefiting others. Well, the idea is that actually by us turning in, taking a moment, working on ourselves, sitting down to meditate, not only are we not harming others, we're giving them much more space for them to feel just kind of at ease. We're not putting a demand on others. So that in itself is, you could think of it as a passive or indirect benefit for others. But then tame your mind. That's the actual intent of shamatha, as we've discussed. So I did want to say it could be that, you could talk about it quite simply like that straightforwardly. And it might, one of the intents of shamatha that we'll talk about later is the point of it. When you talk about the human condition in general, there's 2 aspects. The 2, what they call obscurations that we're constantly with. And it's the obscuration of the kleshas, our disturbing emotions that are constantly at play. We're constantly beset by them. Our We might be fine one moment and then angry another, and we might be kind of feeling well about ourselves and then feel jealous out of nowhere. And things like that, desire out of nowhere, strong emotion is tumultuous to us. It kind of just hammers us over, knocks us over. We lose our ability to, you could say, I'll use a word, I'll explain it a little later, but the idea of agency, our ability to kind of work with our own mind freely. We're kind of you could think of it as we don't have volition, we don't have control when our minds are wild. And so the idea of calming our mind, pacifying our mind, speaks to that. However, one interesting thing about shamatha, and it's effective at that, it's effective about calming our minds, focusing our minds, pacifying our minds, again, taming. But one thing that's kind of incomplete about shamatha is the other obscuration, is the cognitive obscuration. And that's where the explanations and meditations on vipassana are very significant, because they allow us to develop clarity, lucidity, you could say wisdom, understanding about the way things are, so that at a deep level, we're talking about not just ignorance, but fundamental ignorance, misperception. We misperceive things. So shamatha allows us to calm our mind, but vipassana allows us to have a clarity of mind that's necessary to overcome fundamental misperception. So both meditations are useful. But if you talk about them strictly on their own terms, meaning if we only do strictly shamatha, strictly vipassana, they're both very effective, but they're not complete on their own. Meaning they're remedial, they remediate one aspect of our dilemma. And so the idea is you learn one, and then you would learn the other. And ultimately, the aim, when in this tradition, when you talk about things like, and I say this tradition, I mean this tradition of meditation, when you talk a little bit about the idea of Mahamudra, it's got you'd say an authentic Mahamudra meditation that's taught in, like, the manuals, or when you hear masters give teachings on it, it ultimately would have both aspects, the stillness and stability of shamatha, but it would also have the clarity of vipassana. And so, to give another example of why, both of those, to just kind of put them in perspective of their own, is that, there's songs Milarepa would sing about this. He'd say, that if you have shamatha, it could freeze up like a pool, like a lake in a mountain, to where, like, our minds could be still, but they're frozen. They are non-moving. And an example of this would be when we meditate, if our senses become kind of duller, more turned in, and if we don't notice things really going around us in our environment, if our meditation becomes, I sometimes use the word myopic, but kind of just so it's not one pointed, it's so kind of turned in on itself. It's like it's, sometimes you use adjectives like dull. And in a sense, that's not much different than kind of when we sleep, we don't really perceive things. We could have a dull or tuned out shamatha that we develop. Our minds might be still. They might not be troubled. They might be tame, but they could be close to turned off. They might not notice things. Interesting. So, in other words, is that real shamatha? It's incomplete. It's kind of off to some extreme. And one aspect about vipassana is our minds. It's an interesting thing. Sometimes people think, oh, did I get vipassana? Well, vipassana is an explanation. It's a teaching. It's an approach to meditating. But what it's aimed at, again, is clarity. And our minds automatically have clarity. But are we able to access that clarity? That's the problem. Like, we clearly notice things, but our minds are zipping around, from here to there and jumping rapidly. And so we don't really kind of sit with our clarity. So we need the shamatha to make that workable. So in other words, when we clearly perceive something, when we clearly relate to something, when we're aware of something, it has some grounding. If our minds are still enough, we can be with that experience as opposed to be overwhelmed by what we perceive or pulled away by it, jump from one thing to the next. So the idea is we need both. And a good meditation would have both aspects. Something else we might know on our side, about, shamatha is we might be kind of meditating, doing our best, doing our part, and maybe on the outside, people say, "Oh, you're so still," but we also know on our side, like that we're still experiencing the kleshas, or we're still experiencing, you could say, a lack of control over mind. Like mind is wild, and so that alone tells us that, when we do something like shamatha, we do get a sense, even right out, that, hey, we notice things and we begin to work with things. The aspect of mindfulness and awareness, if we're doing it, if we're following the instructions, just at a basic level, we know what's happening in the sense of we place our mind on something. We notice what happens. It either stays with that object of meditation, like the breath, or a statue, or an image, a visualization, or it moves. So mine's either staying or it's moving, and we notice that. So we have some ability, some agency to say, place the mind on the object. Notice that it drifts, it moves rapidly. Then agency, bring it back. Boom. So the ability for mind to be placed, to move and notice, but also to stay. For the mind to not move. So the ability, and again, some of this might sound fundamental, but I'm going to bring it in. This idea that the moving parts that we're talking about is, again, the object of meditation is always an important thing. What are we, when we sit down for a session, what are we placing our mind on? We need to know it coming in, and we need to keep it in you could say loosely in our memory, like, so that we don't drift into lots of other things. Maybe we sit down to meditate and think about, in Buddhism, maybe keeping it Buddhist, maybe we're sitting down meditating, but then we daydream about virtuous activities, or we daydream about unvirtuous things that we've done, and beat ourselves up about it. But is that the meditation we set out to do? Did we say we were going to put our mind just on this object of meditation, on the breath? So we've deviated, even though it's like it's in the same context of the Dharma, we've deviated from the intent of that session, the object of meditation. Different practices have different objects of meditation, and we'll talk about that a little, because shamatha is going to help those. Our natural sense of shamatha that we develop. But there's also this idea of noticing, awareness. We notice what happens. We place our mind and notice. What is mind doing? Is mind staying? Is mind moving from that object of meditation? And then the idea of mindfulness is different. Once there is the awareness, mindfulness brings it back to the intended object of meditation. So we need all three. The object of meditation, awareness to notice distraction. If you don't notice the distraction, there's nothing to bring back. We just are lost. We've drifted completely. We've kind of lost we've even lost the object of meditation fully. If our awareness is kind of disconnected from us, if we lose it. But mindfulness is the ability to say, you could say the strength of mind. I've heard a couple people explain it that way, but to bring it back to the object of meditation. Like, maybe our mind drifts fantastically away from something. Are we strong enough in our intention to bring the wildly distracted mind back to center? So those are qualities that come up. And there's another one we'll talk about a little later called suppleness. But those are some of the key, I guess you could say, vocabulary ideas. Now, I think in previous sessions, someone could give me a thumbs up or down on this, but I think it looked like people had discussed the 9 stages of shamatha, and that's a standard framework for how this process and some of those devices, such as placement, awareness, and mindfulness, work together, how they kind of orchestrate and fine tune. I'll do a quick review of it, and it's really relevant to what comes next. So I'll just do a very quick passing kind of review of the 9 stages. The first stage is to rest the mind. So we decide there's an object of meditation. I'm going to put it on that object. Just that simple. We actually probably pull that with that one. Even if we have a bad session, we come in with that intention. So that one's that's necessary to start any session of meditation. Resting the mind longer, Gyuno Jokpa. So it's the idea that not only am I going to put it on the object, but I'm going to continue to keep it on that object. And then the next one sounds a little different, but it's continually resettling the mind. So it's the idea that, like, we're not only trying to stay longer, but if it gets distracted, we bring it back. We bring it back. We bring it back to center, back to placement of object. Then there's the 4th stage, is fully settling the mind. And those 4 are very much where even really good meditators spend much of our times. I'd say contemporary meditators, people out in the world, people who aren't, if you're not in something like a meditation retreat, probably, or someone who's been able to, like, afford all outer distractions to not be around you, we spend much of our time in there. It's safe to say. Maybe some people are beyond that, but certainly that's kind of when you hear people talk about meditation, like, let's say in magazines or in Q&A questions or these kind of things, that's typically the frame of it. But that's important because that's the first series that we'll talk about. The next is, once we've fully settled the mind, the 4th stage, we go into the 5th stage, which is taming the mind. The mind is somewhat, at this point, because we've repeatedly brought it back and it's settled, it doesn't move as far. Now it's actually tame. It's starting to move much less. And then it's pacified, meaning it doesn't want to move. So there's a shift. In the first 4 stages, we were talking about the mind is placed and it drifts and it's pulled away, and it takes a certain strength of mind to bring it back. But then slowly, once it's settled and once it's pacified, those qualities of if our mind slowly through the meditation, it's drifting less and less, it's tamed and it's pacified, then there's not as the effort. There's a huge shift in effort at this point because it's not going to drift as far. It actually likes to be placed on an object. It likes the object of meditation more than it likes the distraction. It's a huge shift. And then there's complete pacification of the mind, which is a more thorough situation. It's not just pacified in the moment, but it's more, you can think of it as continuous or ongoing pacification. And so at this stage, gross upheaval happens less. It's not just that you're pacified in the session, but it's a more thorough thing to where, for example, like dreams, kleshas, mental disturbances are less effective at disrupting that. And then these last 2 are the 3rd set of the 9. It's one-pointedness, which how to say this, you're able to attain stability through applying the antidotes from distraction. So at one-pointedness, the mind is able to stay focused on an object as long as it intends to. And then after that, once it stays focused for a long time, the final stage is equanimity, or you could say equipoise. Some people translate it as that. And then it's completely natural at that point. There is no antidote anymore. There's nothing to put an antidote on. It's just a resting mind in the most thorough and complete sense. So those are the 9 stages, and it's good to review them because there's a framework. So as I was saying earlier, stages 1 through 4 are kind of the beginning of practice for anyone, and anyone probably entering a session. If you're a good meditator, the whole process could happen faster, perhaps. Like if you've got a good environment and a good habit of meditation, very little disturbance in your mind, very little upheaval or distraction, then this could go quite rapidly. But again, it's at the beginning of practice, and it's establishing the structure of placement. And there is a focus. There's an emphasis on focus and on effort and noticing distraction. It's very, you could say in some sense, it's quite coarse. Those vocabulary words I was saying earlier, things like the place, what is the object of meditation? What are we aware of? Are we distracted or not? Are we able to bring our mind back? It's a little mechanical and coarse, like true or false. Like it's at that level. It's you could think of it maybe a word like gross or general, but not gross, disgusting, but gross as a generality. And at that stage, when we're practicing in that way, we admittedly are more influenced and habituated by our distractions and you could say our habitual patterns than meditation. Another way to say it is like distraction and habitual patterns are the rule, and meditation is the exception. We're coming with a very kind of worldly momentum, perhaps. As beginners, we're not used to meditating. It's unfamiliar to us, but we're familiar with the kleshas. So meditation, you could think of it this way, can be difficult at that stage. But it's interesting. There's still value there because we're noticing a lot that we haven't noticed before. And even though it's an exception if we're beginners, there are moments of sanity and there's moments of agency and volition. We start to understand that we can have an influence on our mind rather than the other way around. Like mind is self-perpetuating. It's habitual, momentum, nonstop. And gradually, from doing those early stages, our minds can be more centered and can be more placed. And it's also interesting because even if we're kind of running back and forth at this level as practitioners, there's still kind of, I'd say, when I hear people talk about it and through my own experiences, I'd say it would be the kind of thing where maybe we're familiar with this. Like sometimes our meditation is just better than others. Like sometimes we're meditating and it's quite developing, quite promising. And other times it's downright frustrating. That's an indicator that we're kind of at this stage. If there's frustration and effort, then it's good to just dial in on some of those fundamentals. But quite, like I said, quite honestly, that's nothing to be ashamed of. It could just mean that we have a lot going on in our life, when we come to a session. And again, I think that's where a lot of the discussion in the Buddhist chatter sphere about meditation is. And that's not a bad thing. It just means we need to get familiar with it and get better at it. The next chunk of them, stages 5 through 7, again, that's where it's taming, pacifying, complete pacification. That's when a sense of the familiarity of practice and meditation and our intention is really established and the mind is more consistently placed. You could, in the session as well as probably off the session, the pacification just starts to feel more familiar and feel better than our gross distractions and habits. We know the habits, we're aware of them, but we've also really gotten to know our minds a little. We know what our distracted mind is like. We know what our placed mind is like. We know what our mind, we have a taste a little bit for how it can feel to be a little bit peaceful and tame. And that feels better than feeling completely turned over by everything that our mind could get pulled away into. And so our value, you could say, like at a deep, subtle level has shifted at that point. Yeah, and so our mind becomes more tame and increasingly familiar with meditation rather than distraction. And we go not only from tame, but we go from tame to pacified. And meditation feels better and more natural than distraction to us. And stages 8 through 9, I have to tell you, they're beyond me in a complete sense. They're somewhat fruitional, but based on what's said, there's a sense of being beyond pacification. We don't need to pacify ourselves anymore at that stage. There's no placement. Excuse me, there is placement, but there's no distraction. So again, there's no need for an antidote. It's a stability that's beyond disruption in the fullest sense. But there's a sense of, you could even say, like earlier when we were saying a word like control, like, oh, I need to control my mind. I need agency over my mind, or whatever you want to call it. That would be effortful. But this would be the sense of control that has no force. It's a pacified mind. Like, there's nothing to really do. I mean, it's actually thoroughly pacified. And the mind is simply and completely, you could say, in charge of itself. So that framework, the 9 stages, shows us not only development, but hopefully diagnostic a bit of what things might be like for us, or where we are as meditators. And where I say where we are, I mean in a particular session, in a particular pattern, within like a session, or in life in general as meditators. Something in there must make sense to us, the fundamentals, place your mind, here's the mechanisms of how to do the meditation. And then, like, how does it feel? Are we frustrated? Does it require a lot of effort? Are we noticing things? That type of level, is it frustrating? That kind of tells us right away. And again, it's not bad. It's actually, but this is a bit of an aside, and this would be a meism. But I like when I share shamatha instructions in groups, which we've already discussed. But one thing I would say is, if you're in a room full of people, meditate for a minute, and things happen in the room. People wiggle. There's a sound, or someone like has to clear their throat, something like that. And you think these kind of thoughts to yourself, like, oh, I clear my throat, they're gonna hear me. They're gonna notice. Gosh, if I take off this hot jacket, it's gonna make a ruckus in the room. It's certainly not a ruckus in any other context, but you'll think, oh, this is wild, right? But if I keep the jacket on, I'm hot and sleepy, and the people will notice me drifting off, and that's even weirder. The thing I like to tell people about shamatha meditation: know the instructions, know what you placed on it, and let this process start to happen. Let it just happen. Like when you notice that you're distracted, just bring it back. Let that happen. Don't be too heavy, too forceful, because then you're like beating the mind up before it moves again, which that's your new object of meditation, beating yourself up. That's not correct either. But really what we need to have, the aside I'm trying to make, is like a sense of maturity. And what I mean by that is like a sense of maturity that, like, some people teach it like this. They say when something happens in the room, like you're meditating and you're still, and you hear a dog bark off in the distance. Did the dog distract you, or did the dog show you for a minute that you forgot about meditating, or that you were daydreaming or thinking of something else? So the dog can wake you up. Like, in other words, the distraction, the disruption, the person rustling in the room can wake you up. But we needn't make a big deal of it. If we make a big deal and say, oh, that damn dog, that my neighbor has, or, oh man, I always have to clear my throat, I'll never be able to meditate, or I'm always the embarrassing person in the room, or these kind of things, we're making a big deal when we do that. Just notice and come back. That's really all that has to be done. But I say that because a sense of maturity, in group settings, like in lateral settings, when you're around other people, is super important. And when you're on your own meditating, if something to wake you up, meaning like to point, and when I say wake up, it might literally wake you up if you've dozed off, but something to figuratively wake you up, I mean, more accurately, we should be thankful for that. Because what if we had some daydreamy thought that we thought of for like 20 minutes and the whole session goes by? Some of our daydreams can be quite meandering like that. So for there to be a car horn honk, or our roommate drop something in another room, those are good things actually for meditation. They're not the enemy of meditation. They're kind of a support, because they're doing the work of noticing our distraction. They're putting out a spotlight on our distraction. So that's a real quick aside about just kind of the mechanics of like, again, the development of this and what's what would come next. Let me see. So gosh, when to move on is the next question. And there's something to say at this point too, because if you, let me look at something actually in my notes, make sure I move in a way that's quite fluid. So an interesting thing about shamatha in that outline I just gave is there's a shift in value. The shift in value from like the intention to meditate, like I want to meditate, to I like to meditate. That, again, that taming and that pacification is where there's a you personally enjoy the meditation. Our familiarity has changed, and we favor the meditation more than the distraction. So we just naturally let go of the distraction and take hold of the meditation if given the choice. And so what's happening is we become to value our awareness and our mindfulness. And again, what's the whole point of this? We were saying to tame the mind. We value a peaceful mind at that point. We might value it before in the gross sense that, like, if you want to talk just general Buddhist framework, like we're in samsara, we suffer these fundamental truths, you know, like, oh, there's all this suffering and these different types of suffering. And I know we all know our own suffering. But the idea, it's a shift because do we know our own peace a little? You know, do we know our own you know, kind of yeah, that own quality, our own quality of peacefulness, like what our mind is like when it's peaceful. And are we familiar with it? Do we favor it? That's the big shift. So at some point we value peace in our meditation in shamatha. And so it's really important. It's fair to say in the sutra explanations of shamatha that and I'm using that in the context in Moonbeams of Mahamudra, the earlier chapters on shamatha are talking about like common Buddhist explanations across all Buddhist teachings of shamatha, as opposed to Mahamudra perspectives of shamatha. It's a little different. But one interesting quality of it is that as we begin to value that, there's this question of like, do I have to get it perfect? You know, in the 9 stages, there's this idea of like, well, is it, you know, is it real meditation if it's not equipoise, if it's not one-pointed? So it's a great question. But here's the thing, it's something to ponder as individuals. Equipoise is kind of the finality anyway. If we had full equipoise, you know, like that's pretty close to, you could say, I'll use the more accurate term than enlightenment, because enlightenment's more of a pure Mahayana concept. It's cessation at that point. It's liberation. And you could say like you're waiting for the end rather than working where you're at sometimes. And to put it in context though, it's said that while it is a perfect path, that it takes lifetimes to do, like incalculable lifetimes, to progressively master that. Do we have that kind of time? So one of the questions that shifts from the Mahayana, you know, from the Hinayana to the Mahayana, is this additional, you know, you could just call them skillful means or additional techniques to enhance that process. And then again, that idea of vipassana, like we're not just trying to still our minds, but we want our minds to be aware and awake. So there's a variety of teachings taught, essentially. that at some point, and we'll talk about that in a moment, the point is as when our mind is supple. It's an adjective that's put in there. But it can be different for different people. We can't wait endless lifetimes to develop further. We have this one short life that we have Dharma in right now. There's no guarantee that we'll have it in future lives. So we're certainly good to take hold of it, but we could be kind of being a bit hard and unreasonable on ourselves if we're thinking we have to have mastered something like shamatha to approach other things. Of course, mastery of it's good. But what ends up happening for most people is that at some point that value comes in. Like shamatha creates a workability of mind by having that mechanism of placement, awareness, and mindfulness. Like the mechanisms of working with our mind are always there. So further meditations, you could say, meditations like loving kindness and compassion. Well, that's also has an object of meditation. So we place our mind on what? Like a person or a being that we want to have compassion towards. There's always an object of meditation when we meditate. And again, the principle of awareness, like, oh, I intended on being compassionate to this person, but I am angry at them. And so instead of having that, I've drifted from it. And my awareness notices, I lost the object of meditation. I'm supposed to be focused on this person, but my feelings are so strong that I've drifted, but my mindfulness is strong enough to bring it back. And so the principles, again, placement, an object of meditation, awareness to notice, are we with that object of meditation or have we drifted? Bring it back, mindfulness. So that's there. In Vipassana teachings, there's, even though there's an emphasis, and we'll talk about a quote from Shantideva if we have time, that basically says, from his point of view, that Vipassana isn't possible without a certain level of shamatha. If our minds aren't calm, we can't make any use of the clarity, is what he's asserting, more or less. So again, we won't have Vipassana if we're not placing our mind on the intention to notice Vipassana and have awareness and mindfulness and have our minds be calm enough and still enough to make use of it. In deity and Yidam practice, I'm actually, with this one, I always remember in Kimball-Katra Rinpoche's Vajrasattva commentary, in the Q&A, someone asks, he gives this great teaching on the deity Vajrasattva, and there's the mantra, and there's all this purification and this kind of thing. It's beautiful. And they say, I'm familiar with shamatha. Does this practice have shamatha? And Rinpoche basically says, yes, it does, because when you focus on the deity, he doesn't use the word object of meditation. But he says essentially that's what you're focused on. The deity in a deity practice is the object of meditation. And you need the awareness to know what's happening, especially if you're doing a long ritual practice, but the awareness to know what's coming and going in the practice, or if we're getting distracted. And if we have the mindfulness to bring ourselves back. So the principles are, again, always there. And in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, I'm sure many of you see Mingyur Rinpoche is coming to KTT soon, but I'm sure many of you see teachings that are shared publicly on Mahamudra and Dzogchen. But it's interesting because that is the same case. The principles are still there, but the emphasis is there is an object of meditation, but the object of meditation there is the awareness. So it's not just place the object, be aware if it drifts. You just are aware of your mind, whatever it does. If your mind happens to be still, if your mind happens to move, there's always awareness. And that's what we're getting familiar with. Aware of everything, you could think of it as a flow of awareness potentially. But the principles are always there. So when you look at something like the formal teachings that we've been doing, like the 9 stages of shamatha, and, place your mind on the breath and the posture and things like that, that is, you could say, how to practice and develop shamatha on its own terms explicitly, just shamatha, and from there, it's something that you can always train in. Like, I'll give you an example. Say that any of you become advanced practitioners or more advanced, and you have commitments, or you're doing things that you're advancing in practice. But say it's also life is life. It gets hard. It's always okay. You're never wrong to go back to something like shamatha. Just take a few minutes, get in the posture, place our mind on the breath and begin to focus on, return to the breath until there's a flow of focus on it. So it's not something that you necessarily move on from a certain point of view, because the principles are always there. We're always placing our mind on something. But we're not always aware of something, and we're not always mindful. But the idea is that those principles are always at play, especially if we're intending on any meditation. And so you can always go back to it on its own terms as a formal practice, but it's not something that you let go of, like, as you progress. Actually, it's something that becomes more subtle or more refined, or some of the principles play out different. Like I was saying, something like Mahamudra it's so emphatic on awareness, but it's not as though there's no object of meditation. It's not as though that there's no sense of mindfulness, and either. It's just the emphasis of what we're focusing on is different. And the idea of shamatha, part of it being so kind of precise and I wouldn't call it narrow in focus, but its scope is very precise, is just that idea that, like, within that precision, we're not trying to do a million things. We're just trying to do one thing without distraction, that one-pointedness, and stay with it till it feels calm. So let's see. So this is an interesting point. Whether to practice, there's a whole discussion in Moonbeams of Mahamudra about kind of when one should practice shamatha or vipassana, and which one should come first. And Moonbeams of Mahamudra, for anyone kind of hearing it for the first time, is a gigantic meditation manual in this tradition, written by Dagpo Tashi Namgyal. It's kind of it's like this big. So it's got like every stage kind of planned out, kind of explained. And what Dagpo Tashi Namgyal says, I'll work with a quote from here for a minute. He says, a powerful medicine for the gradual type, the shamatha, that 9 stages is gradual. The powerful meditation for the gradual type is a strong poison for the instantaneous type. So the instantaneous type is kind of your vipassana type person. Someone, and if you think about it, like, and the reason of this is because if your vipassana is working accurately, you can kind of experience something and just get it right away. And many times, to let you know that's real, in case you're not one of those types, this is also, you can get an indicator when you're around certain teachers. If they can explain something to you, sometimes we call it liberation through hearing, but sometimes if a teacher explains something and you just get it, and then the next day you're back to normal, and it made so much sense, it penetrated so much for you, it resolved so much for you, but then the next day you're kind of back to misperceiving it. It shows you the possibility that what an instant perspective could do for you. The difference is we have to train in that vipassana perspective on our own, on the inside. So again, I'll continue with the quote. A powerful medicine for the gradual type is a strong poison for the instantaneous type. Inversely, a powerful meditation for the instantaneous type is a poison for the gradual type. So putting those two together, if you feel as a practitioner, as a person, that you do better with the gradual approach, that should tell you a lot. Because if you're out of that zone, You could, it could be, again, you said, powerful poison, right? Like that could be foolhardy, you could say, of us to like take on something we're not ready for. Or similarly, if you're the kind of person who's kind of able to get it, you might be beating yourself up by going too terse with your meditation, too compressed, like, oh, I can't make it one breath without my mind being distracted. If we're too tense, too strict. I remember a teaching kind of set where Kimball Sutram was saying something along the lines of, this one always stays with me, is that like it's sometimes our minds are like a snake. Like a snake will kind of start to drift and move. And if you hit a snake, bam, don't move. The snake's gonna move. It's gonna move. And our minds are like that. If our minds start to move and we're too abusive with it, like too hard on ourselves, and hit our minds and say, don't move, then we're going to create tension and probably if it was a snake, it'd be an attack. But we can kind of essentially at that point, we're attacking ourselves. We need to kind of be soft with it. But the idea is that again, we have to, it's a little bit like know thyself. Like, are you, and maybe even at the time, sometimes we think of this makes it sound like there's a type of person. I'm an instantaneous type. No, me, I'm a gradual type. I mean, that could be, but how are we today? How are we lately? Or how are we feeling? Are we benefiting from an instant, like from kind of being sharp and getting a direct thing? Or is that a little wild for us? Is it better to take it easy and develop more incrementally? So a lot of, that's what I was saying at the very top of the session. There's a lot of relativity here, and that relativity is us. Like we need to know ourselves in the meditation. And he continues, he says, by overly believing in the explanations found in the sutra oriented texts, this, like if we overemphasize this core shamatha, in other words, without physical and mental suppleness, shamatha won't be attained. So in other words, and this is where the word, we're going to talk more about suppleness, and I might even break away and just jump to the definition of it if I start ranting about it or something. But shamatha won't be attained, without which vipassana won't be achieved. So in other words, if we're kind of overly emphatic, that can be a problem. And without the shamatha and vipassana, those two, there will be no realization of suchness, meaning like you won't kind of get a sense for dharmata or or the nature of how things are. And they conclude that achievement of that approach cannot and will not occur. And so what people can do at that, I'm going to break away from his quote for a minute, because he goes into an aside a bit, but what can happen is that we could say to ourselves, like, I can't, his actual quote says, now is not a time for meditation. Well, what that looks like in today's world is people say, oh, I tried to meditate once. It didn't make sense for me. I can't do it. Kind of making it sound like something like you're missing something, like you're an incomplete person. Like it's not possible for you. I cannot do it. And it causes you to turn your back on meditation. Like you say, it's not workable. This just isn't possible for my mind. And he continues, he says that's quite absurd if it was true. It would mean that the various kinds of Dharma the Buddha taught for different levels of abilities are incorrect. So what it means is we're misapplying, when people say that, they're misapplying what approach they need for themselves. You could almost say they're not appropriately diagnosed. And it basically leads to abandonment, actually. And not just, you could say like, maybe a person's like abandoning the idea of meditation or abandoning Buddhism, but actually more significantly, when we do that, aside from those kind of, pillars of thinking and approach, like we're abandoning our own sanity. I mean, that's what we're trying to work with for this, to tame our minds again. So it's quite a bad situation, actually, if we kind of misdiagnose ourselves. And then he continues though, and this is important. He says the Dakpo practice lineage contains both instructional traditions, shamatha and vipassana. One is taught for the instantaneous type, who first eliminate their misinterpretations concerning the ground and root, and are then taught the techniques for resting. So for some people, there's a precedent for starting with vipassana, and then Mahamudra worked, or excuse me, then shamatha worked for them. And the other is provided for the gradual type, who first pursue mental stillness and then are led to vipassana gradually. Although these days, most people being of the type that has a very clear and active mind would be at this point more appropriately guided according to the first approach, here I will give an explanation according to the latter approach in consideration of what is better known at the moment. So what does that mean if I say that kind of back to you, like in short form? It means that, you know, if even if, let me put it to you this way, if you, let's just say that, you know, some people, like I said, they try these things, they get frustrated and walk away. Well, they're not here, but they're you know, they've kind of misapplied things probably, or there's something else that would actually work for them because the Buddha taught this range of methods. And whatever they've tried is just not exactly at the right approach, according to Dagpo Tashi Namgyal's assessment. But the other side, if we're good sports, let's say we go to all the teachings and Lama says this or Rinpoche says that, we go to, you know, now it's time to meditate, we'll do it. And we were good sport, we go with it. We sometimes say, oh, my mind's kind of sometimes this way, kind of sometimes that way. What type of person we are has a lot more to do with our development. If you're a gradual type, you'll notice you're gradually developing. The instantaneous type, again, maybe a teacher says something, maybe you have an insight in your life, you know, like maybe one of the, you know, there are, you know, kind of sutra explanations of Vipassana as well as these Mahamudra and Dzogchen explanations, but instantaneously you understand something and have a breakthrough in your understanding of it, a clarity. Good. But if you're a good sport, you're doing, you know, you might run into all of that, you know, you're around. And there's a lot going on in Dharma. And, you know, sometimes teachers say things or sometimes they're coaching us gradually. But the point is that what Dagpo Tashi Namgyal is saying is that through either of those, like working gradually or instantaneously, that the other is possible, right? So like some people, they have so much of a breakthrough that their minds become still and they calm down. That's the way they do it. But if they try to start off like, I guess I'll work gradually, it just frustrates them. Or the other side is that some people work gradually and then they have a breakthrough. You know what I mean? So in other words, either kind of approach, both approaches are taught, but both approaches can provide for the other. We can find, you know, you could think of it this way. It's possible to find Vipassana through our shamatha. And it's possible to find the calm of shamatha within Vipassana. Both are possible. I found that very personally reassuring because initially I did at a certain level pretty good when I first started meditating shamatha. But I'd say like, you know, I'm not talking about little plateaus. I hit a hard plateau after a while. And then I was still stuck with certain concepts in life that were hard to break through for me, even if I meditated. And certain teachings on Vipassana and pointing out instructions, these kind of things made sense of it. And then my mind calmed down considerably. I wasn't as tense and overwhelming, you know, in my meditation, in my, you could say, my shamatha approach. Okay, so that said, shamatha is crucial though to our progress, and there will be some quotes if we want that we could look at about that. But we don't necessarily have to have this kind of cosmic mastery of it to be in a position to progress into other teachings and other things. but there is a point that said that we do need the quality of suppleness. So I'll just go ahead and jump to that in my notes. What is suppleness? So sometimes people, like translators, have translated suppleness as pliancy, workability. As like I tend to think of that, like how workable are our minds, or how you could say how stubborn, difficult. It would be the opposite. The Tibetan word is Xinjiang, and I think this question of agency, it really comes up. Like there's a point in meditation where, like, if we're frustrated, then our minds are clearly more dominant. Our habitual tendencies are more dominant than our intention to meditate. And that's a frustrating position. It's not necessarily workable. But by workable, I mean that we basically are able to do it, not necessarily master it or have some perfect idyllic meditation, but that we're able to. It's basically functional within the principles, like again, of object of meditation, uh, awareness, and mindfulness. They're functional. Don't have to be perfect. We don't have to be an equipoise for that to be at play. And sometimes I like to look at it as like, do we have that to some degree? To some degree, do we or don't we have, volition or agency over, within our mind, with itself? Do we have some margin of, you could say, like mind, controlling our own minds or our own choice in how we work with our minds? Or is it the other way? We just don't, it maybe even for a moment, like sometimes we don't have so much choice, or maybe we're overwhelmed. So I'll get into a quote on subtleness, or rather a definition from Moonbeams of Mahamudra. And he's quoting what's the compendium of Abhidharma. And he says, what is suppleness? It is physical, because the body is meditating when we're in the posture, physical and mental flexibility that comes about because the negative propensities of body and mind have been eliminated. So by saying that means we need to be somewhat, when we were talking about that shift from the 4 stages of shamatha into the 5th through 7th, we need to be somewhat tamed to do this. It needs to be workable enough with intention, because that's where in those stages there's a sense of eliminating the negativity, and there's more of a, you could say, a favorability at play. In terms of like our minds aren't as obscured and our bodies aren't, like they're in from the perspective of meditation, they're more workable, more pliant. The negative propensities of body and mind prevent the cultivation of physical and mental virtues. The force of suppleness brings physical flexibility, the attainment of physical buoyancy. That word's used, like a lightness. Like if our bodies are heavy in meditation, you can't expect necessarily that they are completely going to be tame or peaceful. So what we expect of moving on could be limited there. Are our bodies at ease, free from problems such as heaviness in the body? And pliancy brings mental flexibility, joy, and happiness. And mind, again, is more important than the body. I mean, I say that if we're kind of older, or our bodies aren't being so kind to us sometimes, if we're dealing with some illness, our bodies are always, kind of, they're a secondary factor compared to mind. But, suppleness refers to the joy and happiness attained once mind can focus on an object without trouble. So it's nice. The mind likes to focus on an object. It likes to be placed on an object. Physical flexibility is what allows the activities of the body to take place readily with buoyancy. Mental flexibility is the specific quality of the mental factor that is the cause for creating buoyancy and pleasure in the mind engaging in a correct attention. It feels nice to be focused on whatever we're focused on. It is called mental flexibility because when the mind possesses that mental factor, it is able to engage its object unhindered. Then he continues with just a statement. He says, suppleness cannot be perfected right from the beginning of our practice of samadhi. However, a modicum, a bit of it, can be achieved through effort. When we have refined our abilities through gradual training, we will achieve suppleness. Furthermore, through the force of achieving mental suppleness, the winds, the energies in the body that serve as the causes for achieving physical suppleness will circulate in our body. Once they have pervaded our body, we achieve physical suppleness. So this is interesting. It's actually saying that once our minds, through the effort of meditation, eventually our minds become supple, then our bodies become supple. And the other part that's worth saying to this, again, it doesn't come at the beginning of practice, but it can happen. And when you put that together, this crux, this, in other words, do we have to be at the 9th stage of shamatha, perfect shamatha practitioners, to go any further? No, we have to have some basic workability that is suppleness. And in that real shift is where our minds find joy in meditation, essentially, like where it feels, again, more familiar. It feels better than distraction and disruption in our habitual mind. So suppleness is really this key. So I know that sounds I've said a lot, but I wanted to make two kind of end caps to work back from a little. We talked about the functions, and I consider that review. The 9 stages is review, but it sets up a framework for a diagnostic, and that diagnostic is the shift from effort in meditation to joy in meditation. And we're not even talking about the 8th and 9th stage, the one-pointedness and equipoise or whatever. We're not going that far, but the shift from it being difficult to meditate to not. And I was painting 2 principles, that the idea that shamatha is a value. There's the formal practice of shamatha that you've all been hearing about for the series, but the value of having the joy of peacefulness in mind, that value and those principles of, again, object of meditation, awareness, and mindfulness, they pervade all instructions, from you could say the most fundamental to the height of Buddha Dharma. And in fact, like if you go through meditation manuals, almost every section starts with it either breaks down the posture of the body, or it'll say go back, return to the posture of the body. It's a reminder. And it'll say, okay, now the object of meditation, and it'll refine what that is. It'll refine that framework of what we're aware of, what we're placing our mind of, and how to work with it at that stage. So there's the principles are always at play, but at the same time, if you're not sure diagnostically, you have the 9 stages, but the real question, if you're really feeling that you don't want to let go of shamatha, you're saying, oh, I don't know, I'm still working on this, when should I move forward? The answer is suppleness. Like it is, and the suppleness has to do, again, the idea of at some point our minds find, again, he says it's like joy, delight in meditating, and having our mind on that object of meditation. So it's not a fight anymore. it's something we delight in. That, now, again, we don't have to have total mastery at the 9th level to be able to do something. We just have to have enough workability and you could say appreciation, like that joy, to take it further. So it's 9:18. I think we go until 9:30. I did not know if there were questions. I have other things I could unpack with this. I made a ton of different reference points. And if there are questions, we could put them in the chat. But if there aren't, I can squeeze something in the last 5 minutes too. 10 minutes.
There have been no questions so far.
Okay. One thing that Karmapa's written on this that I really, really enjoy. It's kind of brief. There's a book that KTD published a long time ago by Karmapa on the 37 practices of a bodhisattva. It's his kind of commentary on it. And in the 37 practices, there's mention explicitly of shamatha, but this has to do with solitude. And in Moonbeams of Mahamudra, he actually talks about the conditions for shamatha, and it has everything to do with like quiet environment, a stable environment, no disruptions, things like that. And so there's a framework for shamatha, and solitude can kind of be very conductive to a calm and peaceful mind. But solitude is an interesting question. Sometimes we ideate it, but we don't do so good when we're alone. We get lonely, or the mind craves complexity. Like we're not ready for that solitude. We want to start big plans. Or the other hand of it is that we do want some solitude, but we're always around other people and we're caught up in these other plans that we resigned ourselves to. So he says, there's the quote from the 37 practices says, by leaving harmful places, afflictions, kleshas, gradually decline with no distractions. There's a meditative principle there. No distractions, virtuous activity naturally grows. With a clear mind, certainty in the Dharma arises. To rely on solitude is the practice of a bodhisattva. And what Karmapa says, he says, solitude is extremely important, especially for calm abiding or shamatha meditation. It is usually said that if we find a nice solitary place and practice well for about 3 to 5 months, we will achieve calm abiding. It is sometimes even said that if we do not attain it within this time, we will not attain it at all. But that may not be completely true. Then he says, for me personally, that kind of outer solitude is over with. The most solitude I have is in my own room, and even there is not so much. So it's kind of an interesting commentary because at the time, Karmapa had just gone to India, and this teaching was given well before it was published, and his life is kind of he's very much this beginning to become a public figure, broader than just some kind of Rinpoche, that if you know, it's not or even the head of a lineage. It's like he's there's always people wanting to see him at this point. It's very public. It's a real shift. And then he says, what is real solitude? It can be divided into inner and outer solitude. And that's a great distinction there. Outer solitude is like, are there other things around us? Like we're saying, these projects that we're in, environments we're in, companions, pressures, all these kind of things. Inner solitude, like what's going on the inside. Are there, like sometimes Mingyur Rinpoche, and actually the teachings already called it monkey mind, but he, like what's it, crazy monkey mind, he says, but what if there's more than one monkey, right? Like what if it's like a whole circus in there, is there solitude on the inside? There's certainly a circus of the kleshas sometimes, and a circus of thoughts coming up, like kind of this thought, that thought, it's always, a big thing. And probably like lots of circus music too. To continue with the analogy, whatever our personal situation may be, whether we live alone or with others, outer solitude is not enough because it is something external, out there, like a time where there is no crowd around us. But actually, outer solitude is not as important as inner solitude, because since all disturbances come from within. Therefore, it is more difficult to find inner solitude. We create our own crowd of thoughts that jostle our mind. Since they are within us, these distractions are not easily banished. You can If you've got someone you don't like in your life, you can tell them there's the door, or to where to go. You know what I mean? You can say, get out of here, that kind of thing. But these inner distractions are not easily banished. And go away, anger, go away, jealousy. Nope. Like we've trained it into habit, so it's going to keep coming back. It's a lot more difficult than telling someone to go away or leave your life, which is still pretty challenging if they don't want to go. They're difficult to find. Inner solitude is the most important thing. Outer solitude alone is not enough. So he's recapping that. But I like this final sentence. He says, please try to find real solitude. So even though Dagpo Tashi Namgyal is kind of telling you, go out and find solitude, go out and retreat, like Karmapa is actually, he's humble enough to say, hey, like, I'm not out in some retreat, but what I'm looking for is inner solitude. That's how I interpret that. And I think it's really cool. Like I come back to that one a lot because that's what matters essentially, is our state of mind. And we know it. Like, I mean, that's the part, like, again, we can appear calm to others, or something like that, or maybe no one is paying attention to us. That happens a lot too. But we know on the inside what's going on in our minds, and if we have that kind of inner solitude, or I like to think of it sometimes as inner quietude. Like, it's okay to think. I mean, actually, it's a whole different aside, and I don't want to upset the apple cart on the way out the door. But in more advanced teachings, like the point of shamatha is not to not think. Actually, the mind does cognize by its nature. Like, you don't unthink. But the point being, though, is that you don't want to necessarily like kind of lose your perspective within it. So we do need that kind of inner quietude, and it's important. But if there is movement in the mind, that's okay. If there's quiet in the mind, that's okay too. But we need to know what's what, and that's where awareness is really key. But I like Karmapa's parting shot with it, like, maybe please find kind of inner solitude, or he says, I think, authentic, real solitude. But yeah. And I remember once going to a teaching with a Drikung yogi, and he had said something to the extent of kind of like his parting shot was, kind of like, may you find, like shine, shamatha is shine. So it's like the like still placement, like peace and placement. Like, may your minds be even, may they be at peace, placed in peace. It's like a nice thought. And he used the etymology of the word to kind of send people off. And I think about it often, because I think that's like a nice place it's nice to place our mind within peace and to kind of abide. Yeah, the word abide in peace is ne is to abide. So it's like to abide there, to stay there, to rest there. And yeah, it also shows the value, again, like, it's not just, here's the meditation, do it, or I can't do it, or I must do it. It's saying to ourselves, like, do I value it? Do I have a sense through doing all this meditation what my mind is like, and is my mind have this quality of peace? Is peace possible in my mind, even for a moment? And if so, like, that's nice, and so may we have that. But with that, if there were no questions or comments, we will maybe do the dedication and long life prayers.
Still
Oh,
moved.
wait,
Oh,
Vivian, Lama Jinpa, thank you very much for such a very clear. Oh, thanks. Sorry if sometimes I get in the flow. Those of you who know me, like, I kind of I get started and I just go. I wish I was a little bit better about, like, kind of stopping and doing meditation, but we only have like an hour or something, and I'm leaving a lot out in my notes, are about half. So thank you. Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, Jared. Good to see you. And I hope you're doing good, and Bonnie and Adrian too. Yeah. I'll look at people one more minute while we pull up the yeah. Oh, Marianne. Ooh. Thank you, Lily. Let me go 1 second. Got sloppy. 我教坤云之让着karma吧，教坤真嘞，只得karma吧，教坤都说王个karma吧，哦，言着的全嘞小天so。 오소남디예 탄제 직바니 톱니 니베 드라남 밤제네 제가 나치 발라 축바 예 시베 솔레 로와 녀로 쇼 잠바 바wo 지타 킴바당 군드 장고 대안 대진데 데라 큰기 예수 다글로 칭 게와 디다 탄제 라디노 산지 쿠선 예베 신라단 주님 민주 덴베 신라단 겐드 미체 덴베 신라기 지타노와 만람주 쇼 두지 레자 자웨 첸레바 karma ba ten tenbe ningbo di chokta kunkya kyabjin yunmi che kakpa rabel belwe trashi sho. I saw your note too, Bonnie. It's good to see you. And I'm thinking of you guys all the time. But yeah, this is a treat. I liked it a lot. I love getting a moment to just kind of think of these things and review these things. The only thing I would say that I would have emphasized more would be the point that shama, for most people, most traditions, most teachers emphasize you have to have shamatha before you proceed to other things. Dagpotashi Namgyal answers it as suppleness is the quality, the level of your shamatha, but there's famous quotes from Shanti Deva and other people that encourage you to start with shamatha. But I don't think you have to necessarily stay there indefinitely. So I just wanted to make sure I'm saying that because there was so much I had to leave out. But yeah, good to see everybody. Good to think on this, and I'll hopefully run into many of you again and again.